I'm a WCU alum, and during my time here, I majored in psychology with a minor in women and gender studies. I also worked as a peer educator for 2 years at the Center of Women and Gender Equity, one of the sponsors for today's event. I'm so excited to be here today to introduce Ijeoma Oluo as our keynote as we celebrate the launch of the Women and Gender Studies collection. Ijeoma Oluo is a Seattle-based writer, speaker, and internet yeller. Her work on social issues such as race and gender has been published in The Guardian, Esquire, Washington Post, Elle Magazine, New York Times, NBC News, and more. She has been featured on The Daily Show, All Things Considered, BBC News, and more. Her #1 NYT best-selling first book, So You Want to Talk About Race, was released in January 2018 with Seal Press. Her second book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, was published December 2020 with Seal Press, and her newest book, Be a Revolution, How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too, was released in January 2024 with Harper One. Ijeoma was named one of the most influential people in Seattle by Seattle Magazine, one of the 50 most influential women in Seattle by Seattle Net, one of Peru's 100 most influential African Americans in 2017 and 2018, and is the recipient of Feminist Humanist Award 2018 by the American Humanist Association, the Harvard Humanist of the Year Award 2020, the Media Justice Award by the Gender Justice League, and the 2018 Aubrey Davis Visionary Leadership Award by the Equal Opportunity Institute. I read Ijeoma's work in Dr. Justin Sprague's class. It was called Let's Talk About Race. And one section that really stuck with me was a section about intersectionality. And the quote was, intersectionality helps us ensure that fewer people are left behind and that our efforts to do better for some do not make things far worse for others. Intersectionality helps us stay true to our values for justice and equality by helping to keep our privilege from getting in our way. Intersectionality makes our systems more effective and more fair. And with that, please join me in welcoming the wonderful Ijeoma Oluo.
Can y'all hear me, or do I? Give me a second. I awkwardly fight with being a tall person. All right. Can y'all hear me though? If you can't, raise your hand. That way I'll figure out. Okay. All right. So let me. All right. Is there like a volume control on this, or do we can turn this up because? Lovely if we could. All right. Yeah, that better? Great. And if at some point y'all can't hear me, just raise your hand up or like go like, and I'll try because I am not very loud. I'm loud in some ways. Just not volume-wise, I guess, is how to say it. It is a pleasure to be here talking with y'all. I have not been in this area in probably like 5 years. Oh, awesome, someone just turned it up, I can feel that, thank you, that's great. And so it is lovely to be here, this is my first time on this campus. And I'm gonna just jump into discussion, and I do wanna, have Q&A, so just a reminder to think about questions that you'll have for me. I always like to brag that when I'm on colleges, like younger people are much less shy with their questions. And I always try to use that whenever I have to talk to a bunch of people my age and they don't want to ask anything. And I'm like, why am I here? Going back to school, young people ask questions. So don't make me a liar. And please think of some questions and ask them. And we're going to have a nice conversation. So I guess what I'm going to start with here is I'm going to talk a little bit about where I was in 2020. So in December of 2019, Mediocre came out. So I really started out 2020 in promotion for my second book, and I was really exhausted. And I had been really public, I'm always really public kind of with everything, I think, that I wasn't going to write another nonfiction anytime soon, and I certainly wasn't going to be writing about race anytime soon, because believe it or not, most people who do this work, especially if you do this work from an impacted community, we don't enjoy it. It is not fun to spend all day researching violence against you and the people you care about. And having done that nonstop for, at that point, I'd say 7 years of just pure research and writing for my books, I was exhausted and feeling really traumatized and feeling very exploited in a way, because people do love to read about a thing. They don't like to do about a thing, right? And people would buy my books and then say, oh, it's so sad what's happening. Too bad there's nothing we can do about it. And I didn't want to do this anymore. I had always wanted to be a writer since I was a very small child. But if you had asked me as a small child what I wanted to write, you know, the history of white male supremacy would not have been the answer I gave. And I wasn't feeling connected to writing anymore. I wasn't feeling the love or the joy. And I was realizing in conversations with other people that there comes a point where it becomes problematic. If you are writing on race, if you are trying to fight white supremacy, and you find that white supremacy is taking your joy and using up all of your talents, it stops being an effective tool. And so I was determined for a couple of years I wasn't going to write on these topics. Everything I wrote would be about race at least a little bit, because I'm a Black woman. And therefore, you know, I could write about knitting and it's still going to have a racial aspect because we all live racialized lives. But then suddenly a few months later, I was under contract for another book for Be a Revolution. And so what happened was 2020 hit. 2020 hit, and I think for many of us, we were quite devastated. And I think for a lot of you, especially the years that you were in, I have children around many of your ages. Well, kind of straddling your ages. I think I have a 23-year-old and a 16-year-old. And so hitting these years was very, very difficult. But it was difficult for us all. And as all of the systems around us were failing us even more than they had before, what became really clear to me is that it was community that was keeping us going. That those of us that were going to survive, who did not have immense inherent privilege, were going to survive because of the work that community was doing and had been doing for multiple generations. And so I decided that if I was going to be taking a couple-year break, I didn't want to go out on a book dedicated to documenting white male supremacy. I wanted to go out on a book dedicated to highlighting the work that people have been doing for multiple generations in our communities to keep us alive. And so that was kind of where Be a Revolution started. And for that book, I spoke with 34, I believe, movement workers all across the country of multiple races and ethnicities, all different walks of life, who were doing work at the intersections of systemic racism. And so that meant a lot of different places, right? There were people who were working under gender justice, people working in healthcare, people working in social work, people working with housing, the environment. There's always room to tackle racial justice because race is a part of every system that we experience in this country. And as I was talking with them, some of the movement workers I was talking with have been doing this work for 5 years, some have been doing it for 25 years. And I always kind of started with, how did you get into this work? And a lot of people started with their college years. Now, the story wasn't always the same. Some people said, you know, I came in fired up, ready to go. I came in thinking I was going to revolutionize my campus. Some were like, I came in not having any idea what movement worker activism was and had no idea that this is what I was going to be doing. Some came in thinking they already knew everything and then found out out they didn't know everything. Some people came in thinking they knew nothing and realized their lived experience was actually giving them a lot of important knowledge on how to do this important work. But regardless, it was really clear that for those who have the privilege to be at a college campus, even if it does take its toll, even if it is still a white supremacist system for most students who enter into a 4-year or 2-year program, those who had the privilege to be there, these were very formative years for their lives that ended up being dedicated to community and to movement. When I say that their lives have been dedicated to community and movement, it doesn't mean that they would necessarily all call themselves activists. In fact, very few people did. I think a lot of times when we think about movement work, when we think about activism, we have this really concrete idea of like, you're going to be protesting a thing, you're going to be handcuffing yourself to a thing, you're going to be making signs for a thing, you're going to always be actively, loudly disrupting. And for many people, there is a time limit on that sort of work. That work is vital and it's true and it works. It's not very sustainable for the long term because you have to find a way to pay rent and feed yourself, and you might want a family, and you might have, you might get sick, your family might get sick. All of these things can happen, and it may not be something that you're physically able to do. But when we think about what we think about activists, a lot of times we think that's all there is, and people who aren't doing that aren't actually doing the work. If you're not, waking up, blood, sweat, and tears for the movement, you're not doing the work. But I am a Black, queer, neurodivergent woman. I am the daughter of an immigrant, daughter of a single parent, single parent myself for most of my children's lives. And my existence is a testament to the everyday work of movement workers and people dedicated to community. And that work, I firmly believe, is in my blood. I believe that for every marginalized community, it is how we have survived. We just live in a capitalist society that tries to erase those stories. We live in a society that says to us that success is something that happens individually, that you're supposed to turn 18, move out, make it on your own, have your own nuclear family, and your success is how much relative power you have compared to others. But that has never been the story of success or survival for my community and for many other communities targeted by our systems. And so when we talk about the work that these once students, now lifelong movement workers do, what they're doing is finding their passion and their talents, and they're integrating this work into it every day. And making the spaces where they know they are uniquely suited to do something better, more intersectional, safer, more radical, more revolutionary. So, how do you start? It can feel really hard to get started on a college campus, especially at PWI. It can feel really overwhelming. I know it's not like y'all don't have other things to do. But first, it's important to recognize that you are a part of systems right now. A lot of times when we talk about systems and like systemic oppression, we talk about it in this really kind of abstract thing, the system, the systems, the man. Your friend groups are a system. Your classrooms are a system. Your department is a system. Your campus is a system. Higher education itself is a large system containing many other systems. Your church is a system. All of these spaces that have rules and operations to serve multiple people and to get resources from and to multiple people are systems. So I would say first and foremost, one of the most important opportunities that people have in their college years is to practice not only interacting with systems, but challenging and changing systems. This is supposed to be, and I suppose is a very important word in this sense, a place for you to learn how to shape the world that you're going to be entering. Now I say supposed to, because I would say that as long as we've been saying that, there are certain populations that most college campuses do not want to ever challenge the system they're in. And I would say that in this last year, campuses have been saying that even more so. It has been absolutely wild for me to watch campuses actively oppress the speech, the activism, and honestly, community-mindedness that they should be applauding in their students, that is supposed to be part of their responsibility to nurture and instill. If you can't do it now, trust me, it's even harder outside of these walls. Now is the time to start. You have kind of a closed loop. You can test different things out. You have other people with more experience than you who can give you feedback. You have authority you can challenge in hopefully a safe way or a relatively safe way. You have social interactions that continue day after day, so you can try something new and see how it works, and you still have to see each other the next day. You have to work through it. These are prime times to learn the skills that you will need for your entire life. Now, this isn't just practice. What happens on colleges and universities matters, not only because these are very formative years for you and all of your peers and everyone that you interact with. And that's even if you are staff, right? I talk to people in academia, and this work takes on your entire life. So this space is your life. What happens here matters. But also, colleges and universities set a tone for the broader community. That's part of the reason why there's such intense political pressure on these institutions to limit the amount of power that students and faculty feel that they have. What happens here matters. You are not only writing the story of your own life, but you are a major character in the story of your peers. And you have to determine what character you want to be. Do you want to be part of why you and others learn how to step into power and change the world? Or do you want to be part of what people simply have to survive to get out of here? And that's an important question to ask. I am now many years out of college, and I can absolutely still clearly remember people who are on both sides of that. The people who helped me become who I am, and the people I had to survive in order to become who I am. So it's important that you recognize the systems you're in. It is important then to ask how these systems work. How do they work for you? How are they impacting you? And it's not just, I feel good today, things were easy today. Really taking apart your day-to-day interactions and the impact of the systems you're in. And you can start with just one. Pick a class, pick housing, pick a department, pick some aspect of your life here. Just one, and investigate how it impacts your life, how it could impact it in the future. And then you need to ask, how do they work for others? Others outside of your particular experience, your particular privilege, or your space of oppression. And then you need to ask, what are the mechanisms of it? Why does it work the way it works? Who benefits from it working the way it works? What are people doing to make it work that way? And then you start asking, what would be needed to make it the space or the system it needs to be? One, does does it need to exist at all? Does it need to be replaced? Or are there some particular barriers in place that prevent it from being something that is accessible to people, something that can be helpful to people? And then you find your privilege in it. When I talk about privilege, people get kind of cringy about it because it's a word that people love to just toss out, right? You can just say someone is privileged, or you can say that's hella privileged, and it's like, you know, throwing a little tiny grenade into the conversation to blow it up. But privilege is actually an incredibly important idea to fully understand. And those of you who read So You Want to Talk About Race, you've got a whole chapter dedicated to this. But it's valuable to understand. Privilege are points in which a system was built to serve you, or at least appear to serve you, or at least be neutral in your experience. There is always a flip side to it. It's not a privilege if everyone has it. It's a privilege when others do not. And it's important to understand that, because when you're addressing an issue, you can't see the entirety of an issue if you're not first recognizing the privileged standpoint in which you're coming to it. But also because the flip side of that privilege means that there are often people directly harmed by the way in which your privilege works. Privilege is power. It is a space where a system is built to serve you, or at least not harm you. And that means that you have the luxury of being able to move through it and manipulate it often in a way that others do not. And so when I say it's important to understand your privilege, it's not just so that you're not an asshole. It's so that you can say, I have power right here in this particular way to do something. My favorite analogy that is so outdated, because the child I'm talking about now is 16, but when I would lose something, and I have ADHD and I'm always losing something, and I would like looking for my keys, looking everywhere. I can't imagine what weirdo place I put them. And like my son was younger, he was like 6, and he'd be like, what are you doing? I'm looking for my keys. And he'd say, okay, I'm gonna help you. And what he would do was just follow me everywhere I went. If I looked under the couch, he would look under the couch. You know, if I looked in a drawer, then he would look in the drawer. And all it was doing was running into him. And instead of using his skinny little arms and tiny little body to get into places I couldn't get, he was just an obstacle to me getting to work on time. And when I would turn around and go, what are you doing? He would say, I'm helping. And that's what it's like to try to address systemic issues without acknowledging your privilege. You're basically running around copying people who have to do this work, duplicating their efforts, and not paying any attention to the ways in which you might be particularly suited to do something that they cannot. I don't even know if my son knows I use that analogy anymore. He's still not better at helping me find things right away. He's just made much taller than me, so he's even less helpful. It is so important that we understand this, because then you can find a space where you want to do the work, where you can do it more effectively. And then you're able to identify peers who can do that with you. You can invite people into that space. But the work that you do, because we all do have privilege, and because we should be actually trying to leverage what privilege we have, has to be informed by those less privileged than you. Not only should it be addressing the harm done to those who are most impacted, but the definition of success should be set by those most impacted. And that requires accountability. And accountability is vital. And so I'm going to actually talk a little bit about what accountability is. Because first and foremost, accountability is a relationship. We talk about holding people, holding systems, holding all of these things accountable. It is impossible to hold anything accountable that isn't in relationship with us. That is why I, as a Black woman, can't get police accountability. The police are not in relationship with me. We do not have any vision of future together. They do not need me for anything other than whatever dollars they could get out of my body once I'm entered into the system. They do not care what I think about them. They do not care about my well-being. I cannot hold them accountable. I can't hold my local politicians accountable. I live in an incredibly blue state that just knows that they're going to get the votes they're going to get. They do not come to my community. They do not knock on my door. They do not care what I think about what they do. And so accountability is relationship, first and foremost. And I'm driving that home because I find even in movement work, we try to hold people accountable that we've never tried to build a relationship with. And the relationship doesn't mean you're best friends. I am in relationship with people I can't stand. All the time. It's part of life. And there are plenty of people in relationship with me and they can't stand me. It is important because it's how we move forward. Because it's how we accomplish our goals. It's how we continuously affirm humanity. And if you are an abolitionist, it is the only vital alternative to carceral systems. And I am an abolitionist. I do not believe in the enslavement. I do not believe in the forced punishment, in the isolation of other peoples. I don't believe in punishment. I believe in accountability. So what does accountability require? And I'm saying this because you're actually in a great space to build accountable relationships. It requires some shared vision and goals. If you want the complete opposite things from people on every level, what's accountability then? You have nothing to build, you have nothing to protect. So part of that is identifying where you have shared vision and goals, stating it. A lot of times, as someone who spends a lot of time in conversation around social issues and is brought a lot of social issues, I find often we just assume that everyone's in the same room for the same reasons. And you don't find until everything falls apart that you never were. So one is clearly stating what your goals are and finding where they lie. Or finding some sort of underlying principle, some sort of shared benefit. And then it's also understanding where your goals and vision differ. And that's important as well. Understand it, understand whether it's something you can respect, know whether or not it's something that harms your overall goals or not. So that you don't suddenly find that there was this whole other second motive that undermines the relationship and all of the work that you've been putting in. And this is not just for social work, social movement work. This is also like, if you want a better relationship with your parents, finding shared goals, having a vision for what you want that relationship to be and communicating it. It's one of the best tips I have for getting parents who may be reluctant to accept who you are or may feel threatened by a differing identity you hold, is by identifying at least a shared vision for the relationship you want and getting them to sign on. It requires communication. And I say this, it requires communication that is flexible and intersectional. We often forget that people communicate in different ways and different styles. So I have ADHD and I'm autistic. I communicate in a very particular way that can throw a lot of people off. And a lot of people communicate in ways that really frustrate me or overstimulate me or make it impossible for me to understand what's being said. And so I have had to learn how to be open with the ways in which I communicate and the ways in which I hope people can communicate with me, so that I can also be open to the ways in which people need me to communicate with them. There are people with different abilities. Not everyone can access a voice note, right? So understanding communication that is as accessible as possible. It will not always be fully accessible. Often that's impossible. But you can even communicate that, right? Communicating the limits of the accessibility you have. But learning how to talk, having respect for the different ways in which we communicate with each other, and feeling safe enough to be able to say what your needs are vital. Trust and honesty. None of this works if you can't be honest. None of this works if people can't call you to account and you can hear it. None of it works if they can't call you to account and you can trust why they're calling you to account. Conflict resolution. This could be a whole another lecture. I'm going to be far more brief than I should be. I would say, like, pick up some Mariana, pick up some people who specialize in how to, get your Mariana, get your bell hooks, read how to be a loving community, but also the process of working through conflict in people that you've decided to be in community with. And that also means normalizing conflict and being able to differentiate between harm and conflict. Something that makes you feel bad isn't inherently harm. Something that makes you uncomfortable isn't inherently harm. And one quick tip that will help you differentiate between the two is usually when someone is trying to manipulate a power they have or think they have in conflict, that's usually where you get harm. And that power could be size, stature, race, ethnicity, disability or not disability. It could be many things, right? It is important to have shared experiences. Accountability requires that you share some things in life. Not you grew up in the same neighborhood or you have the same history, but it means if you're in movement work with someone and you only show up to meetings about movement and you have no idea if they have a family, if you didn't also maybe show up to one of their open mics, you're probably not actually in relationship with them. It means building broader connection. Because we exist beyond struggle. And if there are people who are only in your life for struggle, they're not really in your life. And it can become quite dangerous because then you end up in relationships that often feel the need to create struggle when there isn't one. So that you have a reason to be together. You have a reason to have community. It's really vital that you build community outside of struggle. And finally, you need consent. And that's the hardest part. Because you can't actually force people to be in community with you, and you can't force people to be accountable to you. And there are times where I've had relationships break down, important relationships in movement work, and I have tried to open up resolution with people, and they don't want to. And I can't force that. I have no right to. And so therefore, we aren't in an accountable relationship anymore. And so remembering that consent piece is vital, and we see a lot of people thinking, what if I pushed hard enough, if I bullied hard enough, I could get someone to come in. You always have to come from a place of consent. And so one, it's important to recognize, what does anyone get out of this? Why would someone come into an accountability process? What do they have to lose if they don't? What do they have to gain if they do? And has that been fully communicated? And then, what do you do when you can't have it? And the final thing I'll say about accountability is it's very rare, even in interpersonal relationships, that accountability boils down to two parties. Even if, one day you're married and you're having an issue with your spouse, the accountability circle does not begin and end in the marriage. You have an environment that's impacting how you act. You have your childhood and all of the stuff that you brought from that impacting how you act. You have whatever financial pressures you may have in your life, whatever is happening at work. You may have whatever is happening politically. And accountability also means taking a look at all that are contributing to conflict and can contribute to what you want to build, and pulling that into your discussions and your visions for the future. And so this is a high-level way of saying that these are things that you can actually build right now. And I always say small. And that can feel really frustrating when we have a world where there's actual genocides happening, right? Where we can feel so incredibly disempowered to say start small. When like, I don't know about you, but I just want to find a way to yell at the president all day. But the important thing to remember is that you are impacted personally by what's happening in the world, and so are your peers. And just like it is very hard to feel like you can impact what's happening on a national level, it's important to understand that what's impacting you the most right now and what's impacting your peers is what's happening right here in relation to it. And it's important to understand that the mechanisms that enable what happens on a national and global level start here and require everyday participation, or at least everyday willful ignorance, in order to keep working. Every politician we have who thinks they don't have to listen to us started as a hyper-local politician who learned they didn't have to listen to us. Every system you encounter that feels like it can exploit you has smaller local levels. And every bit of power that can be had to leverage it is magnified on that level. And so it is important to start here. And if you don't believe me, I used to say every conservative politician, but believe just about every politician in this country right now who is exerting such immense pressure on spaces like this. If you don't believe me that you're powerful, believe them, because they're scared to death of you. They're scared because they understand the impact, not only that you can have, but the impact that people have had in colleges and universities for multiple generations. If it can't start here, I don't know where it can. And I absolutely believe that this work can be done. But most importantly, I need y'all to be able to get through these years. And you can't get through these years intact, at least not ethically and morally and psychologically intact, without putting some of these things in place. You are going up against systems every single day. You have to learn how to be in community with each other. You have to learn how to fight for each other. And you have to learn how to have joy together and a shared vision of the future together. If you do that, not only do you get through these years more than intact, but enriched and a more full vision of yourself. But you come out ready to change the world. Thank you. So if you're going to be a Q&A, and there's a mic here that can go around there's 2 mics, so we don't have one person just zooming around the room. So if you have any questions, don't make me stare at you awkwardly. It's weird for us all.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. I am so curious to know, in community organizing on college campuses, so often I hear folks with a lot of privilege say that they're scared to do something, that they're scared to step up, that they're scared to be disobedient, that they're scared to take action. And I guess I'm curious to know, do you have any strategies that you might share in combating that fear or supporting people who are fearful in those moments?
I mean, I would say first of all to recognize that fear is completely normal and that won't leave you. Like, you don't get to a point where you go out to an action or you decide to take on a system and you're not risking something, because that's how that works. Like, they want to discourage action, and there will always be risk. The risk is relative. But I think one thing that's really important that we don't do well enough is to talk about what you have to gain. Not only if you win, but in the process. So like for me personally, I have been very active around housing for many years, but especially for this last year. And a lot of people are afraid to speak up. They don't want to lose their job, they don't want to lose friends, they don't want to get arrested at a protest, they don't want to, there's all of these things at risk. And we talk about that, and we talk about, protecting, and we hear the news stories of who's being kicked out of a campus or who has this happening to them. We also don't talk about the everyday games. Like for me, as a Black, queer, neurodiverse woman, I have the strongest idea of who I'm safe with right now than I have ever had in my life. Because every time we move in a way that you have more to lose, you realize who would be here with you and who won't, right? So this last year, I've learned who actually would have made me unsafe in my work and in my life, who I couldn't have counted on. And as heartbreaking as that is, being able to turn around and say, I am safe here with you. Even if I'm not safe in these systems, and I never am, I am safe here with you. And being able to share that, I have probably the tightest community I've ever had in my adult life right now. Because we know when it comes down to it, these are your ride and die folks, right? Like, these are the people here for you. But I also know I took that step. I'm weathering various storms, and I know I can survive it. And there's something very freeing about that. I am not afraid of deepening my work, deepening my studies, that it will show me something wholly inconvenient, because I have taken some of the inconvenient steps that I absolutely feared and found that I can survive them, and I am stronger than that. And so I think part of what we need to get better at is offering up a vision for, one, what a space looks like when we know that people care and are invested. Two, recognizing how much safer we are in numbers, right? And how many of us there actually are. And I think with movements that are heavily silenced, it's easy to feel like you are completely alone. And every step that you take, and people can see you take it and see that you're still here, they have the strength to. So when it comes to like this last year, I knew that, I was going to be taking steps that a lot of my peers wouldn't take. And I had to trust that if they saw I was still standing, they would be willing to take them too. And many did. And just as I take these steps because I've seen others take them, the truth is that most people believe on some level in freedom and justice, even if they don't understand it fully enough, even if they haven't investigated their privilege and the ways in which that violates their beliefs. And so taking a step forward in it, that's what my therapist tells me is the first thing you can do is actually live it yourself as openly as possible. And that can be one of the most affirming things for people who are afraid. And then really communicating not only the vision of the future, but what there is to gain. And that also means you have to experience it yourself. So if you're closing yourself off to the joy of being in community, to those moments of laughter or commiseration, if you're not showing up for the everyday life of the people that your movement work with, you won't actually have that story to tell. And so it's really important that we live fully in those moments and that we communicate that clearly. And then I think it's important just to be clear about how much what we're doing is erased from popular narrative. The reason why it feels scary and it feels like no one's doing anything is because the things we are doing are erased. The rise in global fascism that we're seeing right now is a response to a rise in global resistance. And that part has been erased. People are talking right now like we are on the precipice, like we are in some weird Marvel movie and there's been supervillains plotting in the background to surprise us, right, with this horrible, evil future that we will just roll over and die for. And the truth is what they're doing is they're responding to global uprising. They're responding to BIPOC community all over the world, educating and empowering themselves and trying to break away from harmful systems. We are at a time of extreme scarcity as far as capitalism and the wheels falling off of the entire thing. And we are at a time where knowledge is being shared more broadly than ever. And that means that those that capitalism is really trying to squeeze are fighting back in a way they haven't before. And so the rise in fascism we're seeing is a response to a rise in movement work all over the world. And remembering that people are successfully activating every day and fighting every day, and really highlighting those stories is also super important. So talking about what's happening around the world, talking about movement work around the world, talking about what's happening locally, sharing your stories of success, everyday success, sharing your joy, it can help take out that fear, because you can remember then that you're part of a multi-generational global story, and we all know. This is not the worst that we've seen. It's not the worst we've survived. We have pulled each other through far worse than that. And we have to remember that and lean into that history and recognize that it is an honor to be in this space and time and to be able to fight alongside people in the image of our ancestors.
Thank you. What do you do when, I know you talk about like having shared goals with like other people. What do you do when the people that you have these shared goals with don't have the same idea of what counts like as a solution?
And it depends, right? So there are, like I was actually talking with another movement worker the other day. He DM'd me, said, hey, can we have a conversation? Because he's like, I feel like we're in two very opposite spaces as far as how we see liberation. And he was like, but I also feel like you're someone I can talk to. Can we just hash this out? And we ended up having like this 4-hour-long conversation. And it boiled down to, I'm an abolitionist and he's not. And so we have very different and often competing ideas of what it is, of what liberation is, especially when we're looking at things like, not just elections, but like local politics and local movement. And so what we talked about, what I said to him was, there are going to be spaces where our work may well be at odds with each other. And I will not be able to support what you do. And that's where I have to find out, one, where we can come together. And we have to, because everyone is in a different place with different topics. Where we can't come together because it may well endanger other people. So if you're going to be bringing cops into a meeting, I am not going to be there. I'm not going to bring my people in there because that inherently makes a lot of my people unsafe, right? But if there's a thing where you need support and that's outside of it, yes, we can come together on that, right? And then also recognizing where we have the same obstacles. Right? And saying, okay, you know what? You may disagree, and diversity of tactics is important. We can at least focus on this obstacle. We know that this one obstacle is in the way of both of our plans. We will work on that. That being said, if you're working with people and they're actively harming part of your community, there may be a space where you're like, I'm sorry, but anything I do legitimizes that harm. And we cannot work together. But it's important to differentiate between that and what is actually internalized harm. And a lot of times when we find we can't work with people, what we're often seeing is what I describe as internalized harm. Like for me as an abolitionist, oftentimes when I'm working with other Black movement workers and they're saying, but we actually need cops to keep us safe, what I'm seeing is a lot of internalized anti-Blackness, right? That kind of fear of our own community instilled in us, and this kind of in the back of our head, the idea that we actually need to be monitored and controlled. And I'm not looking at that person and saying, you're the enemy. I'm looking and saying, oh, here is some harm. And I can have empathy for that and recognize that part of the work I do is in that, even while I know I need their consent before I can do any work with them along that, right? But even just me living and doing my work can be an example. And also sometimes working alongside people is one of the easiest ways to show, to prove whether what you're doing works or not. And they can watch you do it and watch it work. And so you can sometimes just say, you know what, this is the space, this is how I'm going to do this, you do your work and how you need to. Let me know if you need backup. Let me know if the systems come in, but also watch me work. And oftentimes, we have seen that when people come together, because the truth is it's often the most marginalized people in a group that are leading work. And there are people who watch them who disagree with half of how they live their lives. And then watching them go, oh wait, this isn't what I was led to believe it is. And this does work. Or they can look at it and go, that does not work, and absolutely affirms the way that they're doing things. But scarcity of tactics works. And I would support anyone who is actively trying to oppress systems, provided they aren't trying to oppress others in the process. And that's where those are conversations to have, and that's where you look to protect yourself in the work that you do. And so that's why I say it's important to not only find where you have shared goal and vision, but where you don't. And be really clear on that. But then recognize that you don't have to like anyone, you don't have to respect anyone, they don't have to like you, and they don't have to be nice to you for you to understand that you have a role in community to protect against any oppression you see. And so often they can be like, I don't agree with your tactics. But if they step in and try to stop you, I'll be right here, right? And so it's about that kind of strategy and that support. And you can expect that from others. And actually in Be a Revolution, I wrote about a chapter, and I was talking with a Native movement worker, and he was talking, Matt Remley, and he was talking about how he was working on the Dakota Access Pipeline. And he was like, okay, there are not many Native activists. Like Seattle has a decent Native population, at least politically seen, right? But Seattle's very low. Seattle loves to have the optics without actually listening to people. And he was saying, well, Seattle is a place that always wants to seem on the forefront of things, but we don't have the numbers. So what he did was he looked and said, who's profiting off this pipeline? Okay, how are the people who are profiting off of this? How are they also profiting off the oppression of others? And so then he was able to go to Black liberation movement workers and to undocumented rights workers and say, look, these same banks that are bankrolling this are also profiting this. And they had wildly different tactics. And just said, if you will show up at our protests, we'll show up when you're outside the mayor's house, and we'll show up when you're at the detention center, and can we count on you to show up at city council? And it was a great way for them to be able to increase their numbers, strengthen the work they were doing, without actually changing the work that each group felt was important for them, and each method they thought was important for them. And they were able to get a lot done. And Seattle became the first major city in the country to actually put in these ordinances saying that they would not do business with banks that were investing in the destruction of the environment or undermining native treaties or the mass imprisonment of BIPOC. And that was huge, and they were able to take that and move that all over the country and pass similar legislation, right? But at the end of the day, then they split apart, Nikita kept doing their work with Black youth, and the undocumented rights workers kept doing their work at the detention center, and Matt kept doing his work in Native spaces. But they were able to see for this moment where coming together was really important, and I think that's a beautiful example of how we can do this work.
Thank you so much for this talk and for your research as well. I wanted to write down these questions, so I wanted to make sure I asked it exactly right. But in the beginning of your talk, you referenced how traumatic it is to write about toxic racism or violence enacted onto Black bodies. So as an activist and as a scholar, one, how do you cope with the pain and trauma in response to what you have seen and what you have read? And then two, how can we support each other in activism in experiencing those things?
That's a great question, and that's actually something I've been thinking a lot of right now, right? I have probably the most exhausted community I think I've had in a long time. And so one, I would say it's really important to have people close to you who have lived experience in marginalization, right? So that you don't have to explain things, right? And I think when you're in a PWI, it's really easy to be isolated and to only meet up with other Black folk to talk about things that are going wrong. Being deliberate about a safe space to relax, to share joy, to commiserate without having to like justify and explain your situation, I think is really, really vital. It's important to remember too what you're fighting for. If I spend all day focused on white supremacy, I'm not doing liberation. White supremacy is simply the barrier to Black liberation. Black liberation is my work, right? And so that means I have to not only be fighting white supremacy, but I have to be giving the actual work of Black liberation, like my time and energy. And that means insisting on joy, insisting on rest, insisting on care. And so talking about that, being open about that, rejecting the idea that as a Black woman, I only exist to serve and only exist to serve my community, that I don't have inherent value and that my well-being doesn't aid that value, is something I have to be really, really cognizant of. Because it's really easy for me to think if I don't fight all the time, no one else will. And that it's selfish to care for myself, that it's selfish to have joy, it's selfish to, live in this moment. But every day we are dealing with systems who say we don't deserve to live and that how we live does not matter. And so it is actually an act of resistance to remember that how we live now does matter and to insist on joy when we have it. I am not great at this, and so I do have to actually schedule it. So I have, for me personally, I have small daily routines of things I know are only for me that I do. One, I love makeup, and like my makeup routine every day and sitting down and being like, I'm dedicating this half hour to myself and how I want to feel is something I don't negotiate. And the more stressed I am, the more I give to it. And for me, then it's also movement. I store anxiety in my body, and getting it out and saying I need 3-4 walks a day for myself alone in order to get that out so that I feel like I can keep doing the work is vital for me. And then I also have a Black queer therapist, which I know is very hard to find, but keeping me going. And then it's also just important for me to remember that we are living every day and to connect with that and seek it out. So I literally have saved videos of Black lady laughing. I have, my spouse leaves me goofy voice messages of him just singing. He cannot sing. He's a hip hop artist, cannot sing Love You Honey, sorry. He knows it. And he sings these goofy songs, remakes of old R&B songs for me, and I listen to that when I'm really stressed out. And it's just these moments of Black joy that kind of hold me. And then I think it's also important to remember this work will last your whole life. It will always be there. And so there will be days where you need to just eat your lunch and rest and let a thing slide because it's what's going to keep you going. You will have that battle tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And so some days, if you're being true to yourself, you're being consistent. And I think a lot of times there's pressure that says if you're not fighting every problematic thing you see all the time, you're not being consistent. But grinding yourself to a halt is not consistency because it will end your work far before its time. Recognizing your own care is vital. And so shifting tactics, resting when you need to, investing in community, having ritual that reminds you of who you are and the fullness of who you are. Don't let your hobbies lapse. Make those times are vital to the work. That's kind of how I keep going. And then the final thing I would say, and this came up over and over again in my interviews, you have to have your own definition for success, and it has to be achievable. We know the big goal, right? The big goal that we may not see in our lifetime. And because it is so big, and because the world can be so awful, it's really easy to accomplish something spectacular and say it's not enough. But Like, I fundamentally believe Black Lives Matter. I betray that if I do something that helps a Black life and say it doesn't matter, right? And so knowing what my definition of success is, and knowing that each human being is indeed a universe, and that every Black life is sacred, then that means every day I have definitions of success that are attainable to me, that I have to respect if I want to respect why I do this work. And I would say that is one of the most important things we can do, because observers will try to say whether or not you're doing successful work because they want to see how it measures up for them. And often it's a very capitalist and ableist idea of success. What you need to figure out is for yourself, what is your definition of success that affirms life? And if you have that, I don't believe you have a day that's a failure. Even if you have really hard days, even if you lose a really big battle, even the act of showing up, you showed up and you affirmed life for that day. And that's a beautiful success. Question again?
This is going to be our last question.
So as someone who's also queer, autistic, and has ADHD, how do you deal with when there are so many people who don't understand the difference between accountability and punishment? Because a lot of the times, I didn't get diagnosed till later in life, so there were all these things that were happening to me, and I didn't understand why and why I kept being punished. Now I do understand that it's just I have trouble with certain things. I have trouble communicating the way other people communicate, and I'm not a mind reader. So when people kind of just expect you to mind read, and then if you don't do it correctly and you don't conform to their norms, then they punish you instead of helping you develop as a person. Because I'm always asking for feedback. I always go into, friends just being like, hey, if I make you uncomfortable, I'm not trying to, there's a difference between action and intention, and I want you to tell me so that I can adjust myself to make sure I don't do that to someone else. And, it's just it's there's no in between, if that makes any sense. I want to be a better person, but people won't let me, and that kind of makes me afraid to engage in community, because I feel like it just keeps getting smaller and smaller because people don't understand the difference between accountability and punishment.
Mm-hmm. That is a great question, and I'll say there's a lot of layers to this. First, I'll say, so my younger son is also autism, and he was diagnosed at 6, I think. And we were very fortunate in that the psychiatrist who worked with him when he was younger first worked with Black youth from very oppressed communities. And he was really clear in that he approached talking about autism the same way he approached talking about racism, which is you have the right to exist in the world, and you have the right to the same accommodations and considerations as others. It is not just that you need to learn how to communicate with others, because there's a lot of pressure on autistics to do that. It's the world needs to learn how to communicate with you. And relationship and the consent of relationship means that you both bring your vision of a relationship together. And I think that often many neurodivergent people, and honestly, many BIPOC, who are in a space where they are the minority, are conditioned to think that you conform yourself to others. And then the problem is when they can't accept that you can't do that perfectly. But even that is not relationship, right? Relationship is we both bring our full self into this space, we talk about our boundaries, we are responsible for our own personal boundaries. And we talk about what we want to build together. And even in friendship, it means talking about what you want to build together. So talking about how you, and so thinking about what you envision that relationship to be is really important, and offering that up. So, you know, when I'm in relationship with people, as a neurodivergent person, I am thinking, how do I communicate with people best? And what's the balance between how they need me to communicate, right? I can literally go 6 months without talking to someone and think our friendship is fine. My neurotypical friends cannot, they think I hate them. And I'm like, but I didn't tell you I hated you. And so finding a middle ground of like, okay, I can't communicate with you as much as you like. It's draining to me. And also, if I don't have a reason to call, it doesn't make sense to me. But I do recognize that a reason to call will be occasionally to remind you, I'm not mad at you. Okay, I can figure that out. But that also means that you have to trust me when I say that if I don't call you and say I'm mad at you, I'm not mad at you, right? And so it's that communication and saying, how do we find this and be open about this, but knowing you have the right to. So when I'm in spaces now, I recognize, just like with any other biases and bigotry, when people aren't willing to hear and learn and grow, they're not ready to be in a relationship with me. It's not I'm not ready to be in a relationship with them. They're not ready. And so you look at if you're doing your part, right? Are you actively communicating what you need? Are you actively communicating what you want out of the relationship? And are you willing to hear where you may be causing harm inadvertently to someone else? Are you willing to hear, you know, what someone would want from a relationship for you? If you're covered, if people aren't missing you and you've offered it up, they're not ready. And it does mean you have a smaller group. But I will say, the more open I am about it, and the more demanding I am about it, the opposite of what you would expect happens. So I thought at first people would be like, I cannot be around Ijeoma because she's so insistent that we talk in this particular way, or that, you know, we constantly think about neurodiversity when we're having conversations. The opposite happens because no one, first of all, there aren't like neurotypicals who have a brain that was made in a factory and it's the same, right? And so what I found, honestly, is like, for me, explaining openly and being very open of like, hey, I'm sorry, but I'm very overstimulated right now. I need you to stop talking to me for a minute, if that's okay. Saying something like that gives people actually permission for when everyone gets overstimulated sometimes. Or if they're stressed having a bad day, like, people actually know they can stop me and say, Ijeoma, I know you are about to ramble on for an hour about this topic. I am tired. And I'm like, oh, I know what that means. Okay, I can stop, right? And they don't feel like they can say that to other people, but they can say it to me because I am so clear with what my boundaries are. And then I would say when it comes to relationships, yeah, it's hard because I think where we learn carceral relationships, we learn it first at home, right? We learn it like our parents said, you didn't do a thing I liked, you're grounded, or this is taken away. And the punishment never had anything to do with what we did wrong. Right? So you came home late, said you couldn't use the phone. What does the phone have to do with me coming home late? Nothing. You were punished. You didn't learn a thing other than obey or get better at hiding what you do. And we carry that into our intimate relationships, we carry it into our work relationships, and we carry it into what we expect from the systems we interact in. So talking about ahead of time what you will do when things break down is a great way to interrupt that. So for me, I often have these conversations around race. As a Black woman living in Seattle, I have a white mother. So with my mom, first and foremost, we talk, what will we do the next time you say something really racist? Right? Because I want to be in a relationship with my mom. I love my mom. She has a very lovely heart and she's trying to unlearn things. But there's a lot to unlearn, right? So the next time you say something that makes me cringe and feel very unsafe, how are we going to work on it? And I talk with her about this ahead of time, right? We will talk when I bring this up to you. I'm not attacking you. I want to have a relationship where we can interrupt these things. And maybe the process gets quicker and quicker and quicker every time. And then you know one less thing you're saying that will upset me, you know, and we can talk through it or we won't. maybe this is what will happen if I feel like I can't talk to you about it. And so having that worked out ahead of time is really, really important. And so I do that a lot with my relationships that matter to me. I will say, you know, like with my spouse, do this a lot, where it's like, hey, if you see me and I am pacing in the living room, like I am already activated, and this is actually what I need in that situation and what I don't need. And so if you need something, like, how are we gonna meet in the middle during that time? And we work it out ahead of time, you know? If I say something and it seems incredibly cold and robot-like to you, how are you gonna bring it up to me and remind me? And we actually have built like code words into our relationship, where he can be like, oh, like we have soup, which is where I just zone out and I'm just staring into space, and he always thinks I'm mad at him because I have a scowl and I haven't spoken for 45 minutes, and I'm completely fine. But then he starts doing things that irritate me because he thinks I'm mad, and I'm like, and so he'll just go, soup? And I'm like, soup, you know, and then we're good, and he knows that that's what's happening, right? Or, you know, if he's trying to like cuddle and I'm overstimulated, I'm like, overstimulated, and he's like, oh, okay, and it's not, I don't want you touching me. I mean, it is, but it's not because I don't like him, it's because I like cannot be touched. And then he knows, like, and then so he's learned to ask, you know, it's like, hey, is this overstimulating right now? No. Oh, great, and then he's all over me like an octopus. And, but in everyday relationships we can have this. So even when I'm speaking, I'm so glad y'all are eating, because usually when people aren't like eating and doing other things, I usually start every talk by letting people know, if you need to get your phone out, you need to fidget, you need to walk around, feel free. Because we don't get that basic accommodation for people who, like me, my worst nightmare is being told, put your phone away and be present for the next hour. I'm like, oh no, I'm gonna have an actual panic attack here at this table. So just recognizing that, and that's the hardest part, especially if you're late diagnosed. I also was, but luckily I think for me, having autistic child, I've had now 16 years of, you know, figuring out how to build accommodation. You spend a whole lot of your life feeling like you were missing something. Like it just didn't work, and watching people have easy relationships and easy conversation and being like, why can't I have that? What is wrong with me? And there is nothing wrong with you. And a lot of the people that you saw were also masking. They were just masking in different ways that you couldn't see. And your brain is really important. And the way in which you think about things is really important and vital. And neurodiversity is one of the main drivers of innovation in the world, whether that's political thought, social thought, actual invention. And so knowing that and unlearning that are two different things. You know, like knowing that truth on an intellectual level and then practicing that truth every day with how you interact with other people and reminding yourself, wait a minute, I deserve to be met halfway here, is really, 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 really important. But, you know, start building, think of your relationships. Like for me, at least the way my brain works, it's really easy for me to think of relationships as a project I'm embarking on and like have a plan of like, and I sit down and like, my son is like, part of the reason why I actually went through the process is because I would sit down and go, so, you know, we have to determine how we want this parent-child relationship to work. And he's like, this is the most autistic thing anyone has said to me all week. No, like, I'm serious. So what are your goals for the parent-child relationship? He's like, stop, you're freaking me out, you know? But it's important for me, and like for me, it actually really works. I get the steps in that I know I need to build. And everyone goes through a process of building relationships. It's just, I think, easier for us actually when we know we can to say, we can design this together from the ground up. And so enter a space knowing you have the right to do that. And that you have the right to expect others to come to your aid and to communicate with you and to understand the different ways in which you communicate. It won't always work, and that's why having the conversation of what happens when you're just not understanding me. Like, do we have a code word or way to interrupt where before you get upset and think that I'm doing something I'm not, you could at least give it this try? And like having that basic agreement helps. And when people won't make it, you know. If people say, no, I don't want to, that's too much work, they weren't going to be there for you. And they were going to do that to anyone. Like, it's not just you. They were going to encounter someone of a different race or religion and have the exact same response. Like, it's not just neurodiversity. I find that people who can't handle neurodiversity can't handle a lot of things. And then also spend time with other neurodivergent folks. Like, active time. All of my friends are weirdos. Like, occasionally someone will bring a neurotypical, like, boyfriend along, and we're like, oh no, I have to practice skills with this person because I don't know what's happening here, and they kind of like change the whole vibe of the room. And we're just, you know, out here all competing with whatever stories we brought to the room and yelling over each other, and we're having a great time, and then wandering off for quiet. And we have one person who's trying to be like, so what do you do for a living? What's happening? Anyways, all that to say, like, it's really hard, and I think there's a lot of pressure to conform. If I had known when I was younger that the exact things that people told me to be less of were why I would be where I am today, I would have had a much happier youth. And I don't know if that would have helped. maybe everything I had to go through was important, but I will say that absolutely everything, like my rock solid sense of justice, my unmovable morals, my systems thinking, my ability to pull 30 different objects and find their connections and put them together. Like, that's why I'm the writer I am. And I'm so grateful for it. And if my brain worked differently, I